Are we ready to move on our next speaker? Our next speaker is Lisa Karlin Curtis, and she is going to talk about how to stop breaking other people's things. Lisa is a full-stack developer at GoCardless. She started out as a consultant working with the HMRC and then smart meters before accidentally becoming a developer. I would like to hear more about that. She works mainly on a Rails app with some forays into JS front end and legacy PHP application. She loves building stuff, but is also really interested in how people interact with each other in a work environment, particularly in software engineering. Having seen the old way at Accenture, large-scale waterfall project, she is now looking at taking the lessons from that environment to the startup scene. And about the talk, breaking changes are sad. We have all been there. Someone else changes their IPA in a way you weren't expecting, and now you have a live ops incident you need to fix urgently to get your software working again. Of course, many of us are on the other side too. We build APIs that other people's software relies on. All the discussions and later on questions to Lisa, you can put to the stream chat. So please, Lisa, floor is yours. You can start your presentation.
Hi, thanks so much for having me, Euruko. This is really cool. I'm Lisa Karlin Curtis, born and bred in London, England, and I'm a software engineer at GoCardless, working in our financial orchestration team. So we're a payments company and we focus on recurring payments. And I'm going to be talking today about how to stop breaking other people's things. We're going to start with a sad story. A developer notices that they have an endpoint that has a really high latency compared to what they'd expect. They find a performance issue with the code, which is essentially an exacerbated N+1 problem, and they deploy a fix. The latency on the endpoint goes down by half. The developer stares at the beautiful graph with a lovely cliff shape, right, really high and then nicely dropping, and they feel really good about themselves, pat themselves on the back, and move on. Somewhere else in the world, another developer gets paged. Their database CPU has spiked, and it's struggling to handle the load, and they've got a bit of a service degradation. So what happened here? They start investigating. There's no obvious cause. No recent changes were deployed. The request volume is pretty much what they'd expect. They start scaling down their queues to relieve the pressure, which seems to solve the problem. The database recovers. And then they notice something strange. They've suddenly started processing webhooks much more quickly than they used to. So it turns out that our integrator, which is on the right-hand side of this slide, had a webhook handler that would receive a webhook from us, and then it would make a request back to find the status of the resource. And the reason that they needed to do that was that the events could be delivered out of order. And so they wanted to make sure that their status reflected what was in our database. And this was actually the endpoint that we fixed earlier that day. I'm going to use the word integrator a lot. And what I mean is people who are integrating against the API that you are maintaining. Sometimes that will be inside your company, like another team, or sometimes it might be a customer. So back to our story. That webhook handler spent most of its time waiting for our response. It was very I/O bound, right? And then it would update its own database. So the slow endpoint was basically rate limiting the webhook handler's interaction with its own database. And it's worth noting that at GC, our webhooks are often a result of batch processes. So that means they're really spiky. We send big sets of them a couple of times a day. So as the endpoint got faster, during those spikes, the webhook handler started to apply more load to the database than normal, to such an extent that an engineer got paged to resolve a service degradation. The fix here is fairly simple. Scale down those webhook handlers so they process fewer webhooks and the database usage returns to normal. or alternatively, beef up your database. But it shows us just how easy it is to accidentally break someone else's stuff, even if you're trying to do right by your integrators. So to set the scene, here are some examples of changes that have broken code in the past. Traditional API changes, right? Adding a mandatory field, removing an endpoint, or changing validation logic. I think we're all comfortable with this stuff and why it could break things. Introducing a rate limit, or even changing your rate limiting logic. Docker did this reasonably recently, and I think they communicated it very clearly, but it obviously impacted lots of integrators. They also worked hard to provide tooling for integrators to self-serve and understand their impact, which I thought was really cool. Changing an error response string. So at GoCardless, we had an issue where we basically found a bug in our own code where we weren't respecting the accept language header on a few of our endpoints. So somebody would request us being like, accept language FR, and we would be like, here is your English error. And obviously, we noticed this and we were like, this is bad, we should fix this. And so we fixed it. And then we got a call from an integrator being like, you've broken my stuff. And we're kind of looking around being like, how have we broken your stuff? And it turned out that they were relying on the previous behavior that on that particular endpoint, we would ignore their accept language header and always respond with an English error. And so they were then using that English error, matching it against a string, translating it and displaying something in the UI. Breaking apart a database transaction. So this might seem obvious in some ways. When we think about our own systems, I think we all know that internal consistency is really important, but it's relevant for your integrators too. For example, let's say you have a resource that can be either active or inactive. And when it gets deactivated, you create a row in an events table, which has some narrative explaining why that's happened. It would be quite natural for an integrator to build a UI that explains why this resource was deactivated using that event, so that the user can understand what happened. Let's say in the past, that event was created inside a database transaction with the status change. And we want to break apart that transaction. So there's now a new possibility for the integrator to handle where the resource can be inactive, but there's no corresponding event to tell them why. And it's entirely possible that the integrator has assumed that this just won't ever happen because it never has. And so their UI will error if they can't find the corresponding event. Changing the timing of your batch processing. So as I mentioned, at GoCardless, we're a payments company, and we have a daily batch process which submits instructions to the banks. And we can see from our logs that certain integrators create lots of payments just in time, so just before our daily payment run. And so we know that if we were to change our timings without communicating with them, it would cause significant issues as a lot of their payments might be delayed. And then the last example here is reducing the latency on an API call, which is kind of what we discussed in that first example, right? Probably a good thing overall, but can have some negative side effects. So today, I'm going to define a breaking change as something where I, as the API developer, do a thing and someone's integration breaks. And that happens fundamentally because an assumption that's been made by that integrator is no longer correct. When this happens, it's really easy to criticize the engineer who's made that assumption. But I don't think that's particularly productive for a couple of reasons. Firstly, assumptions are inevitable. As a developer, you really can't get anywhere without them. So if you want people to write code, they're going to make assumptions. And secondly, even if it's their fault, it's often your problem. Possibly not if you're a Google or an AWS, but for most companies, if your integrators are feeling pain, then you'll feel it too, either immediately or in the long term when you're trying to renew contracts. So how do these assumptions actually develop? We can think of these in two categories as sort of explicit and implicit. So these explicit assumptions are like an integrator asking a question, getting an answer, and then building their system based on that answer. So your first step, if you're building an integration, is to look at the documentation. It's worth noting here that people are quite lazy and they often skip to the examples and don't actually read any of the narrative text that you've slaved over. So you need to make sure that your snippets are super representative of how your system is going to behave. They might also look at support articles or blog posts, perhaps stuff that you've published or maybe something that a third party's put online. And then you have ad hoc communication. And what I mean by this is random emails or phone calls, maybe with like a pre-sales team or your solutions engineers. It might be a conversation that gets had on a support ticket, or emailing the friend that you have that used to work at the company. All that kind of ad hoc communication is still driving the assumptions that integrator makes about how your software is going to behave. Other assumptions are more implicit. Industry standards are quite interesting here. You send me a JSON response, you're going to give me an application/JSON header. So I don't need my HTTP client to tell me that it's going to be JSON, because it can work it out for itself. And I'm going to assume as an integrator that that never changes. Similarly, I assume that you will keep my secrets safe. So if you tell me my access token was used to create something, I'll assume it was probably me. Generally, this is fine, but in some cases you can find yourself in trouble, particularly if these standards change. We had a really bad incident at GoCardless where we upgraded our HA proxy version, which was observing the new industry standard of downcasing all of our outgoing HTTP headers. Now, according to the official textbook, HTTP response headers should not be treated as case sensitive, but a couple of key integrators have been relying on the previous behavior and had a significant outage. And that outage was actually exacerbated by the fact that their requests were being processed, but they weren't processing our responses. And that meant that we had two systems that were out of sync in a really unfortunate way. So finally, let's talk about observed behavior. As an integrator, you want the engineers who run the services you use to be constantly improving them and adding features. But in a way, you also want them to not touch it so that you can be sure that its behavior won't change. As soon as a developer sees something, whether that's an undocumented header on an HTTP response, a batch process that happens at the same time each day, or a particular API latency, they assume it's reliable and they build their systems accordingly. Humans also pattern match really, really aggressively, not just in software, but in all walks of life. You can see this in like the theory of language acquisition. We find it really easy to convince ourselves that correlation equals causation. And that means particularly if we can come up with an explanation of why A always means B, however far-fetched, we're really quick to accept and rely on it. And when you stop to think about it, this is quite bizarre, given that we are all developers. We're all employed to make changes to our own systems. We should understand that they are constantly in flux. We also all encounter interesting edge cases every day, where someone has hit some incredibly unlikely scenario that causes your code to misbehave. But somehow we all assume that everybody else's code will behave consistently and stay the same forever. None of this stuff is new. So a great example of this, if a bit retro, is MS-DOS, which is obviously an old operating system from Microsoft. MS-DOS was released with a number of documented interrupts, calls, hooks, all that retro stuff. But early application developers found that they weren't able to achieve everything that they wanted. And this was made worse because Microsoft would use undocumented calls in their own software, so it became impossible to compete using what was only in the documentation. So, like all good engineers, they started decompiling the operating system. And they wrote these lists of undocumented information, the most famous of which is probably Ralph Brown's interrupt list. And this information was shared very, very widely. And so using these undocumented features became so widespread that Microsoft couldn't change anything without breaking all of these applications that people used every day. Particularly as an operating system, these applications were a core part of their value proposition, so breaking them clearly wasn't an option. We can think of the interrupt list being analogous to someone writing a blog on Medium called 10 things you didn't know that so-and-so's API could do. It seems innocuous at first, but it can cause you problems down the line. Some of these assumptions are also totally unconscious. So once something is stable for a while, we sort of just assume it will never break. This is particularly obvious when it comes to resourcing choices, by which I mean like how much CPU or memory to allocate to, say, a particular pod. Because the napkin math is always pretty haphazard. So if we're all being honest, what we do is we pick some numbers out of thin air, watch it for a bit, and then kind of change it until it seems happy. And that works fine, as long as what that pod is being asked to do is reasonably consistent over time. But as we've discussed, that might not be true. We can think about this in our first story. The database had plenty of resource until our endpoint got faster. So if we want to stop breaking other people's things, we need to help our integrators stop making bad assumptions. When it comes to your docs, document edge cases. Discoverability is also really important. So think about SEO, so that's search engine optimization, and also the search within your doc site. And don't ever deliberately not document something. If it's subject to change, just call it out really clearly so there's no ambiguity. It just gives the integrators the best chance of making a good choice. Support articles and blog posts, keep your own religiously up to date, and again, try and make sure they're quite searchable. If you do come across third-party blogs that are incorrect, try contacting the author or commenting with the fix needed to make the guide work, or even just point them at an equivalent page on your own doc site. If you get unlucky, that third-party blog content can become the equivalent of Ralph Brown's interrupt list and can fix you to contracts that you really don't want to be fixed to. When it comes to ad hoc communication, consistency is key. If a developer wants to understand what might break someone else's stuff, they need to know what communication is going out, ideally in a super searchable format, so they can understand what assumptions might have been made as a result. And in my experience, lots of B2B software companies end up just sort of like emailing random PDFs around, creating shared Slack channels. And at that point, as an engineer, you don't really stand a chance of knowing what assumptions might have been made as a result of all of that communication. So if you're able to have a central repository of those kinds of materials, it doesn't have to be public, but something where you're repeatedly sharing the same information, and ideally something where that information is not static. So there's an expectation from your integrators that you might update that as your software changes over time. When it comes to industry standards, just follow them wherever you possibly can and flag really, really loudly if you can't, or where the industry hasn't yet settled. And there's a lot to think about with observed behavior, so we're going to give it its own slide here. Naming is really important, particularly because developers don't read the narrative docs and just look at the examples. One example is numbers that begin with zeros that often get truncated, like company registration numbers. We've got a field in our API called account number ending. And unfortunately, in Australia, some account numbers have letters in them, which is, just generally quite sad. But that does obviously trip integrators up, even though that's a string. We try and call that out really clearly in our docs by maybe have an example which has that edge case, has the zero at the beginning of the string or has the letter if you're not going to expect it. You also want to use your documentation and communication to combat pattern matching. If you know you could change your batch timings, call that out in the docs. Like, we currently run this once a day at 11 a.m., but it's likely to change. And then expose information on your API that you might want to change. Even if in the back end it's just pointing at a string somewhere, it's just a good flag for an integrator to be like, hey, this might not always be true. And then restrict your own behavior, both by documenting a limit and then implementing it in the code to ensure you keep to that commitment. So we had an issue at GoCardless where someone that we integrate with started adding a load of extra events to their webhooks. And our webhook handlers basically ran out of memory because they were trying to load way too much data. So that's an example where if we'd known that there was a particular limit on the number of items in a webhook, we could have tested against that limit and made sure that our pods were resourced appropriately. For complex products, it's very unlikely that all your integrators will have avoided bad assumptions. So we need to find strategies to mitigate the impact of our changes. The first thing to remember is that a change isn't either breaking or not. I just think this is a completely false binary. If an integrator has done something strange enough, almost anything can be breaking. This binary is historically used to assign blame, right? If it's not breaking, then it's the integrator's fault. But as we discussed earlier, it may not be technically your fault, but it's probably still your problem. If your biggest customer's integration breaks, the fact that you didn't break the rules will be little consolation to the engineers who are up all night trying to resolve it. So instead of thinking about it as a yes/no question, we should think about it in terms of probabilities. How likely is it that someone has made this assumption? How likely is it that this is going to cause an issue? How severe do we think that issue might be? Not all breaking changes are equal. Some changes are 100% breaking. Killing an endpoint, you're going to have a lot of unhappy integrators. But many are neither 0 nor 100. Try to empathize with your integrators about what assumptions they might have made. Use people in your organization who are less familiar with the specifics than you are as rubber ducks. And if possible, just try and talk to them. The more you talk to your integrators, the more you'll understand the kinds of mistakes that they might have made. If you can, find ways to dog food your APIs to find tripwires. And this is particularly good as an onboarding exercise, right? So we ask our new joiners to build an integration against our API, and it helps them immediately put themselves into the shoes of your integrators. It also helps you keep your docs and guides super up to date and introduces them to your product in quite an accessible way. Sometimes you can even measure this. Add observability to help you look for people that might be relying on this undocumented behavior. For example, as I discussed earlier, we can see a spike in those payment create requests every day just before our payment run. And this kind of approach can also help you identify which integrators are going to be impacted so that you can maybe reach out to them specifically. Some of you may be shouting at the screen by now. What about Semver? Now, don't get me wrong, semantic versioning is awesome, provided it's used appropriately, so the identification of the release type is correct. This is a great way to release potentially breaking changes. We should use this not just for packages, but also APIs and webhooks wherever possible. This solves some of our problems, but not all of them. As someone who maintains a public API, there are lots of changes that can't be applied in this way. An obvious example of this might be the timing of our batch processing or reducing the latency on an endpoint. Not everything can be applied on a kind of opt-in basis at a merchant by merchant level. Additionally, every new version that you support increases the complexity of your system, and complexity leads to risk. It makes it harder to debug things, and that can cause other issues. So there's a trade-off to make. If a major version doesn't work for your use case, I recommend that you scale your release approach depending on how many integrators you think have made the bad assumption, and also what impact you think it might have. We want to have different strategies to employ at different levels. If we over-communicate, we get into a boy who cried wolf situation, where no one reads anything that you send them, and their stuff ends up breaking anyway. And strangely, the email in their inbox that they didn't read doesn't seem to make them feel any better. Startup pull comms, updating your docs or a change log. This is particularly useful to help integrators recover after they've found an issue. And you can then upgrade to push comms, perhaps like a newsletter or an email. This is where it gets tough. We all ignore emails every day, so try and make sure the content is as relevant as possible. Don't tell integrators about changes to features that they don't use, and try really hard to resist the temptation to include marketing content in that developer-oriented comms. And then if you're really worried, you can use explicitly acknowledged comms. And that works really well if you have a few key integrators that you want to check in with before pulling the trigger. Perhaps you know there are only a handful of people who are relying on this functionality. Or maybe there are just a couple of particularly important integrators to your business, and you just want to make doubly sure that they're going to be okay. It's really important to make these kinds of changes often. It's a muscle that you need to practice. Otherwise, both you and your integrators get scared and you forget how or lose the infrastructure to do so. And if you're really unlucky, the cultural incentive becomes to argue that a change isn't really breaking and release things without as much rigor or care as your integrators deserve. We can also mitigate the impact of a breaking change by thinking about how we release it. If at all possible, you want to try and make the changes incrementally to try and give early warning signs to your integrators. For example, apply the new behavior to a percentage of requests. That will help integrators avoid performance cliffs and could turn a potential outage into a minor service degradation. Many integrators will have near-miss alerting to help them identify problems before they cause significant damage. If you've got a test or a sandbox environment, that's also a great candidate. Making changes there, as long as integrators are actively using it, can act as the canary in the coal mine to help flag that something that maybe you didn't think was dangerous might be a little bit more tricky than you thought. And the final point here is about rolling back. If your biggest integrator phones you and tells you that you've broken their integration, it's really nice to have a kill switch in your back pocket to stop the bleeding. Now, that's obviously not always possible because it totally depends on the nature of the change. But it's worth knowing what the kill switches are and being really clear internally about when that is and is not possible, so that as soon as that call comes in, you know what your options are and can react really quickly. The only way to truly avoid breaking other people's things is not to change anything at all. And often even that is not possible. Also, we'd all be out of a job. So instead, we should think in terms of managing risk. We've talked about ways of preventing these issues by helping your integrators make good assumptions in the first place, and how important it is to build and maintain a capability to communicate when you are making those potentially breaking changes to help mitigate the impact. But you aren't a mind reader, and integrators are sometimes careless and under pressure, just like you. So be cautious. Assume that your integrators didn't read the docs perfectly, or maybe at all, and may have cut corners. They may not have the observability of their systems that you might hope or expect. You need to find the balance between caution and product delivery that's right for your organization. For all of the modern talk of move fast and break things, it is still painful when stuff breaks, and it can take a lot of time and energy to recover. Building trust with your integrators is critical to the success of a product, but so is delivering features. We may not be able to completely stop breaking other people's things, but we can definitely make it much less likely and much less bad if we put the effort in. I really hope you've enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much for listening. Please find me on Twitter at @paprikatieng if you'd like to chat about anything that we've covered today. And I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Lisa, a lot. I know it's really hard to speak or deliver a speak without seeing the audience. So let me read some feedback for you. Just tune up on this. What happened during your speech? I'm really enjoying this talk. Such a great talk. Wow, that's the best talk of the day so far. Such a great talk. I do felt caught a lot of times. So thank you. Our audience really enjoyed your speak. So are we ready to go to the questions? Yes. Let's go. What about decisions? How should we document the past decisions? Like, why did we do that?
I think this is really interesting. And there's like an internal and an external kind of side to this, right? So internally, I think the best documentation is always going to be in Git because it just sticks around for longer and it's the easiest way to make stuff discoverable. So, there are a whole bunch of talks about this, but like include the why in your Git commit messages, try and make your commit messages atomic, all of that good stuff that we all learn in our first few years of being a developer. But then when it comes to sort of bigger decisions, particularly if those decisions are impacting your integrators, you do probably want to be pushing stuff out. And I'd suggest like a blog is a really good way of doing that. So it's not that integrators need to understand that forever, but it is really good as like a point in time communication of like, this is why we're doing this. And it helps buy people in, right? If they're going to have to make a change in order to mirror what you've done, you want to be like, hey, we're doing this for you, right? We're doing this. We have a good reason. This is the benefits it's going to bring you. Sorry about the pain. And I think a blog is a really good way of distinguishing that kind of point in time communication from your docs, which should be a kind of like static forever documentation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the good idea. Then the next question, can you apply the insights from this talk to user experience? Probably users are often surprised by sudden changes on the website or app. At least the question maker knows that he is.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't have so much experience in that area, of course. I think that one of the things that is very good definitely is like obviously A/B testing and rolling things out to a percentage of your users. It's really useful, particularly if you have a big user base, just to get some early warning signs about that something's not quite right or that, it's impeding people's use of the system. And then obviously when it comes to UX, the best thing that you can do, as horrifying as it is to just watch people using your tool. And, it's incredibly painful. There are some great memes about this online. But it is just the best way to learn about what people expect about your system.
Please do share the best memes of this to our chat or Discord or later on Twitter. We would like to see those. We are jumping around with these different kind of questions. And let's go to the it's obvious to me, but I've struggled time and time again convincing others that naming is a key.
I think this comes down to the fact that it's kind of this observed behavior point, right? So developers do not read documentation. They're lazy. They read the smallest possible number of words to get their stuff working. And we're all guilty of it. And so when you explain that to developers, everybody sort of internally goes, oh, yeah, I guess that is also what I do, right? So if you start there and you frame it in that way, and you're like, if you start at the example, all you see in that HTTP snippet is the name. And that is the first and most like front and center bit of information that's telling you what that field means. And if you get that wrong, and we have in the past, you will spend like the rest of your life having to like try and put signposts and flags everywhere to tell people that the name is slightly misleading and please, don't do this stupid thing. And I think if you frame it like that in terms of the fact that like that's the first thing, it's often the only thing that people really read and that you can't miss it. It's the only bit of information that a developer has to internalize. I think that kind of helps get the ball rolling. Yeah. You can also just use some horror stories, right? For example, Australian account numbers have letters in them. That really threw me, going to be honest. Stuff like that, right? It's just those kind of anecdotes which help free people up.
Yeah. Good examples, really good examples. Let's see what we have here. How about versioning APIs? Breaking changes cannot be in the same version of the API, right? I think that is where versioning of APIs come in.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that, I don't know whether this was before or after I started talking about them, but there are obviously certain kinds of change that you can use an API version for, and you absolutely should. One other thing here that is a bit less common is you absolutely should version your webhooks. So when someone creates a webhook endpoint in your system, get them to pick a version, then that means they can opt in to changes to their webhooks as well, which is just as important to many systems as the API calls. I guess for me, that's kind of the solved part of this problem. But there are just so many other kinds of changes that you just can't do that with, particularly if you don't, if you have a single deployment rather than like multiple deployments per integrator, then inevitably changes that you make just will impact everybody at the same time. And so it's really important to understand how to deal with those things. And I think in the past, what we've done is just say, oh, those aren't breaking changes. My API schema hasn't changed, not my problem. And that's kind of what I'm trying to get us away from. So rather than this binary where it's either like, either we've added a mandatory field and you need a new API version, or it's just like, oh, we're just making some changes to the way that our backend works, and that's got nothing to do with you. And there's just this huge middle ground that I think it would be really cool if people explored more.
Yeah. So next one, how or have you implemented any automated testing between API and integrators pact/contract testing, for example?
So we're quite lucky in that, well, when I first joined GoCardless, I was working on we have like an in-house partner app, which we sort of ended up with by accident, but I'd actually massively recommend it because that point about kind of dog fooding your own API, but it also means that you can have those kind of integration tests. So you can run some tests through in staging. So as an example, when we were releasing our FX product nearly a couple of years ago now, we did a lot of testing with our internal integration, basically just to kind of pipe clean the whole thing and get a feel for what it would feel like to an integrator. And that's like a really useful thing. Obviously, if you can automate that, that's even better. And I'd really recommend having some kind of up-to-date like integration against your API, even if it's quite simple, that just like goes through the really core flows, kind of like a smoke test almost, or a bit like you can use like Ping DOM to do something similar, right, to a website. I think that stuff is really useful. I think there's a lot more that we could do there. We know that we have a sandbox environment, and we know that there are integrators that run their integration tests on that environment every day. So we know that we can release stuff there early, and that will like get us a little bit of more of that early warning signal as well. And particularly if you've got some like really important integrators who have that kind of capacity to build that stuff, it's a really, really valuable thing for them as well.
Yeah. The questions keep flowing in. Can we still continue? Are you ready to answer?
Yeah.
Yes, let's go. Good. Would you consider adding new attributes to a JSON IP breaking change, I'd normally not. I always considered adding new attributes a non-breaking change until the day a client broke because they got unexpected attributes. Whose fault it is in this case, in your opinion?
I don't think that knowing whose fault it is a useful question, and I would really recommend us to not ask that question very much. I think that the industry standard increasingly absolutely is that adding fields should not be a breaking change. And so you should build your client such that you discard unexpected keys in a JSON response, right? And I think that that is like reasonably kind of well understood as an industry standard. Now, obviously, particularly if you're using a typed language, it's quite easy to fall foul of that. So what I would probably do is just try and make sure that in your docs, you kind of signpost that you're like, we're following this standard. And in this standard, we do sometimes add fields to our API without telling you. And that's something that you should make sure that you handle. Yeah. The other thing is, obviously, lots of people now, if you're using like OpenAPI or Swagger, you'll be auto-generating clients for your integrators to use. And that's a really good way of kind of understanding what assumptions they've made, because obviously you have a lot more control in that point. And also just making sure that those libraries are doing what you expect. So if you can provide client libraries, which, as I say, if you can use like OpenAPI, is now really, really straightforward to do, I'd really recommend doing that because it helps protect you against those kind of bugs as well.
Yeah. About the assumptions, there's one question. You said that assumptions are unavoidable and also recommended not to over-communicate the changes, to keep the emails readable and not scare people away by the amount. So this leads to the question, what would you leave out still assumed in the documentation and communications?
I mean, it's a trade-off, and it's kind of difficult to give a generic answer here. I think my point about communication is really, it's this boy who cried wolf thing, is that like, if you imagine how many emails you have to receive that you didn't need to read before you just stop reading any of them. Yeah. And it's like 2. It's really, really small. Like you receive a couple of emails from some service that you use that are like inviting you to a webinar that you're not interested in. And then you don't read any email they ever send you ever again. So push comms are quite dangerous for that, particularly because we are so kind of bombarded with like particularly a lot of marketing communication. In terms of like what changes, the other thing that you can do is just work really hard to like narrow your audience. So rather than telling everybody about everything, if you have the kind of product that has quite a wide surface area, then you just tell the people who use that bit of the product. That's like a really good way of kind of decreasing the number of communications. I think that there will always be assumptions that you don't document because you can't document them explicitly. And also, as we've discovered, no one really reads the documentation anyway. Or at least lots of people don't. But I think you just want to document the most important stuff and also the stuff that's going to have the biggest impact, right? So if somebody gets something wrong and that results in them double creating a payment, like that's one of our sort of worst case scenarios to go cardless, right? Is that you double charge a customer. So if that's the potential kind of problem here, then we want to be really, really clear about that assumption. Yeah. However, if the worst case scenario is like somebody displays a string to a user that isn't quite right, that's something that you can be a bit more relaxed about because it's not something that's going to, in our case, it's not going to move money in the wrong place. And so you kind of need to manage that as well as the likelihood that somebody's made that assumption to think about like what is the possible impact. Yeah. And you really need to empathize with your integrators to do that.
Yeah. We have 2 questions still to go. Do you ever skip doing nice changes just because you know this will result into so much work to communicate the change, or even ship a change without too much analysis, even though you think it might cause a little noise because communication and analysis would be so hard? Of course, I would never do that.
I'm really, really glad you asked this question because this is actually a point that ended up getting cut from the talk because I didn't have time. So yes, 100% yes. And everybody has done this. And the problem, basically, one of 2 things happens. Either they just don't change it because they're like, oh, it's hard to change it. It might break someone's stuff. I'm just going to sort of walk away. Or they do change it, but they don't tell anybody. And they're just like, oh, well, oops, sorry, didn't think about it. and then someone's stuff breaks. And that's this kind of cultural incentives point. And it's really, really important that you try and keep those incentives to be, we have a value at GoCardless called act with integrity. And, you really want to treat your integrators with that kind of respect and care. And the way to do that is to reduce friction, right? It's the same as like shipping code or tests, right? If you make it really, really hard to test, people just don't test. And we know that. It's exactly the same here. So you want to build tooling to make it really, really easy to communicate, get that communication reviewed, have style guides. One of the things that I've often found is like, it's not really clear who is responsible for like deciding whether we should communicate or not. Yeah. And that can be quite challenging. So making sure that you have both like the tooling in terms of in your code, and also you have like processes in place at your company to try and reduce that friction. That's kind of the only fix for this problem that I've ever seen, because otherwise you end up going one of those two ways. And either the integrators end up with a worse service because you haven't fixed those things, or the integrators end up sad because you've broken their stuff without telling them. And, neither of those is really what we're aiming for here.
Yes. And one question we have here left. How long should we keep deprecated fields for our integrator? Sorry, I'm so sorry, for our integrators if they are actually only internal? I have the feeling we are always keeping them forever.
Yes, I've definitely experienced this. I think even internal or external, your policy about stuff that you deprecate has to be, it trades off the like cost to the person of making the change versus the risk and complexity that you're carrying by having the multiple versions. And I think sometimes people forget that second part. Yep. So they're just like, oh, well, it's a lot of effort for them to make that change. And so we'll just leave it there because it's not really hurting anybody. And that's not true. As soon as you have like two different versions running in parallel, that's complexity. That complexity means if something goes wrong and you're trying to debug or reason about that system, it's going to be harder and you're more likely to like exacerbate the problem or cause new problems. And so anything that you can do to reduce complexity is always a positive thing. And that includes like killing deprecated stuff. Yeah. So I recommend you try and have a really hard line and you try and like set an arbitrary day. Yeah. And if that's a culture inside your company that like, this is the day it will go away, you need to have fixed it before then. Unless the world is on fire, it's going to go away. So please make sure that you have dealt with it. And, that can come across as being like a jerk, but actually it's the only way to keep your system healthy. And it's really, really important that everybody and every team feels empowered to make that call. And so you need to keep the kind of power balances between the teams, right? So you don't have one team that's like, oh, our life, we're really busy, we can't possibly do this. You're going to have to put up with it, right? That's a really dangerous kind of practice that I think we've probably all seen.
That is a great advice. So please remember deadline and then just get it off. Thank you, Lisa. You are truly amazing talent, and we have enjoyed your speak, and audience is still talking about the details of this topic on our stream chat. So huge thanks to you, and let's hope to see you on the chat, but otherwise you can find Lisa on Twitter. We can drop the link on the stream chat. Thank you. And we will move on now.